Three, two, one, go.
Hello class, I'm Professor Billington. I have never done a video presentation before, so it's a little awkward for me. You'll have to bear with me. For my presentation, just a little context, I decided to make a cooking class, and what I mean by that is my local high school back in Knoxville, Tennessee, they didn't have any sort of home ec or cooking thing like that, so when I got to college, I was a little lost. Luckily, I had an amazing girlfriend who pushed me to cook in the kitchen more often. So I sort of wanted to create something where I myself would not have to teach the class, but create a rubric that any teacher could pick up and just use it for one semester and to teach the class. And I also wanted to have some sort of format to it, to where if a school did not have a home ec class at all, they could bring that to the school board or to the headmaster, whoever's in charge, and sort of have a general layout or something to go by. How I decided whether this would be a success or failure. At first I was thinking like, okay, well, like, could I do this in a class, or like, what can I do to see if it's actually a successful class thing? But I don't think I could really teach a whole semester and then decide whether it's a success or failure. So I decided to go to my sister, Rachel Pemberton. She has been a middle school teacher for several years and sort of moved up the line, and now she's like the person who walks around and teaches other teachers and gives them pointers. So I thought, who better to judge me in my project than someone who does that for a living? Because she would probably be the one that I would be presenting this to if I tried to enact it in her school. So, to get into how I decided to do it, I decided to base it on an Excel spreadsheet that I have pulled up here on the TV, and I tried to organize it as best as possible. I didn't really decide what form I wanted to do until later in my Kanban and sort of Gantt chart. I sort of had all my information spread out. So when I was doing my Gantt chart and my Kanban and all of these sort of things to help stay organized throughout the semester, I was more focused on the information and not so much how to organize it the best. And that sort of came around and bit me in the butt a little later, which I can get to in the end. So right here, just to go through sort of how everything is laid out, this top section I have the basic schedule of each week going from week 1 through 18. Right here in this first box, if you can see that, is the topics. So just right here, it's not super important what it says. I will be posting the whole Excel spreadsheet as a separate document so you can look through it more precisely. So on that topic, it has things like the first week being basic nutrition, for example. So in that week, it's just instruction. It's not so much like actually cooking. And then once you get into week 2 and so on, it goes into like a meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then some major courses like that. The biggest focus for this is not just to teach them how to cook, but teach them how to cook healthily or in a healthy way and things like that. So in my details in this second section, it discusses what each class should look like, and then in the extra notes, it has things that the teacher should keep in mind when they're teaching that day, or things of what is the point of that day, like why are they doing this? And then on the very end, obviously price is going to be a big deal. So at the end I have a price of just for that food of the day. So each meal is sort of based out on a per group setup. So each class would be laid out as in having like maybe 4 students to a group and maybe 20 students in a class, so about 5 groups per class. Moving down here, we have notes for the entire course. So as I was writing through this, I thought of a lot of stuff I wanted to say, but I couldn't really put it for each day. It's more things to keep in mind throughout the course. So for example, that goal I was talking about earlier of how to cook easy meals that are still nutritious, that is one of the notes for the course. So it's something that the teacher can keep in mind to have good guidelines for going to the course, even though in this project as a whole, there's a lot of room to wiggle and a lot of room for discretion in that teacher-specific situation. Moving down, we have a section of a week at a glance. So at the top in my weeks, you can notice that it's set up into weeks, not days. So I wanted to give a little bit more instruction to the teachers on a week-to-week basis. So for example, on day 1 of just a regular week of cooking would be just for instruction on that day 1. Instruction on what they're cooking, maybe some history behind the dish, or just sort of like what it is. So for example, creme brulee originated in France. So they would talk about how it originated there and sort of what it is. Day 2 would be discussing the nutrition behind the meal. So sort of what the macros you can gain from that, macros being like your proteins, carbs, and overall calories, because that's a really important part of this whole entire project for the students. Going down to day 3 would be prep for the meal. So since not every class is going to be obviously a long enough time to cook a whole meal, I want to give each student enough time to prep. So those prep days, and I have here in parentheses what that sort of means, would be things like pre-measuring a lot of stuff or cutting a lot of things. For example, on the week 2, they're doing breakfast and they're going to cook an egg frittata. There's a lot of cutting in that because of like the vegetables that go into it. So usually you put like onions and cherry tomatoes in there. They would go ahead and have those cut, and then they could put them into Ziploc bags and put them into fridges to save for the next day. So that when you get to the next day, which would be day 4 in the week, that day 4 can be 100% focused on cooking. They already have everything ready. They can just throw it together and sort of go through the steps of how to cook that. And then on day 5 would be more of a reflection day. So maybe the teacher would say, okay, class, what did we learn from this meal? What did we like about it? What did we not like about it? Maybe what did we want to change? Or how could we take that meal and change it into one's own preference if they didn't like it, for example, but still keeping it healthy. So looking at those macros again and things like that. So going down below this week at a glance, we get into our cost for supplies. So obviously with a home ec class, there's going to be a lot of different fees that come in. So for example, going down, I have pots, pans, utensils, electric stoves, and miscellaneous. Sorry about that. And miscellaneous. So pots, pans, utensils, and electric stoves are things that the school would only need to purchase once. So that's something to keep in mind with this budget. So on some of those bigger numbers, like $100 for pots and $100 for pans, they would only have to pay for that once unless one was to be broken. But even then, if one gets broken, that's like a $10 pot that they have to buy the next semester. And same thing for electric stoves. I just looked up some online. They're about $25. So if you have 4 groups, that's about $25 per stove. So I put in $100 for that. So then you might ask, okay, well, what happens if one of those stoves break? Because we're working with high school students, and any sort of student can break things. That's why I decided to add this miscellaneous section. That miscellaneous section is the second largest for budget. It's $500. Once again, that's something where if you don't use all 500 of those dollars, it can just carry on to the next semester. So it's up to the school's discretion on how they use those funds. The biggest would be food, which I put about $2,500, which might not sound like a lot because it really isn't a ton of money. But when I was thinking about it, most of the things they cook in this, I gave like a lot of recipes and things like that, which I'll also get into in just a second. I try to keep it things that aren't going to be super expensive and also things that you can buy in bulk since it is a school. And then schools get also special perks like tax write-offs and things like that. That's another thing to keep in mind. All those things I just said is also in this bottom thing, notes about the budget. So things like I was saying, it can cross over to other semesters and things like that. So moving back up into the top about the week at a glance and what a day of cooking might look like. I have a lot of meals on here. So for example, week 2 is about breakfast and I put egg frittatas, and then week 3 is lunch. So I thought of a sandwich, but like obviously making a sandwich is a little too easy. So I made a chicken caprese sandwich, which has a lot of different things in it. It's also really healthy and delicious. So I included a folder, which is a physical folder. In that folder, I have each thing alphabetically organized, and that's put into this Excel that it has that. And I would have sort of the recipe and the guidelines, for example, the egg frittata right here. And all of that's alphabetically organized. And up to the teacher on how they want to use that. With that being said, like I said earlier, there's a lot of room for discussion in this. So obviously if the teacher doesn't want to cook or teach on how to cook egg frittatas, then, they could do anything. It's just a home ec class. It's something that I am not personally teaching the class, but as I was making this project, I sort of looked at it from that perspective, but it's for any teacher to use. So, right here in this section is sort of where I decided my success and failure. I sent the Excel program over to my sister, Rachel Pemberton, and I let her look through it, and then I told her to just respond on how she would if any person sent that to her, not just like a family member. I trust her to be honest with me because she's always honest, even to a fault, which is like a family thing, I guess. So right here, she said, I do think your project would be doable for an effective teacher to implement. Just in that first sentence, there was some things that I myself wasn't too happy with. She had to put in effective teacher. So I want any teacher to be able to use this, even if they might not be like the best teacher out there. I would still consider it a success overall looking at it, but just with like any project, there's ways to make it better. Through things like Six Sigma, which I don't know if we looked at in this class. I believe we did. We touched on it for just a little bit, but in some of my other classes we did, which is just a basic understanding of Six Sigma. It's just the process of making something more effective. And then right here, she said, I think that you have paced it realistically and have offered flexibility where needed. For example, the budget. What she said about pacing, I was really happy with. One of the things I was most worried about was filling a whole semester about cooking. There's a lot of room to mess up in that. There's also a lot of room to not have enough time for cooking, or a lot of room for the students not to get a really good understanding in just one semester or 18 weeks. So I thought it was really cool she was able to add that in there, and that was something she noticed. In this second little section, she did have a couple recommendations. One of the biggest ones was that I should add a rubric. I guess what that means is like how to grade the class. I put in that the class is a pass-fail class, but once again, that leaves it open to extreme interpretation. Like what is deemed passing and what is deemed failing in a cooking class. Does the food actually have to be good, or does it just have to be edible? Those are two completely different things. So that is something that was very important to me that I thought about after, was in some way to implement a rubric, especially in the later end of the class. So that was one thing I didn't talk about. Near the end here, in weeks 15, 16, and 17, I decided to make those 3 weeks like a final project. So in those 3 weeks, concurrently, the students will make an appetizer, a main course, and a dessert. And my sister came up with the idea that in that week, for example, on how to grade that, the students should pair up into different groups. Like one group should pair with another group to taste each other's food, and then sort of decide on how they should be graded. With that being said, the biggest determining factor on how it will be graded, I put in here that it should be graded by the macros in it. So once again, in the class, it's not just to cook good food, it's to cook good and healthy food. So you can say that a meal looks healthy, but you don't really know it's healthy unless you can know the macronutrients of it. And that was one of the biggest things in this. So looking at the final project, I wanted it to be something that both would implement their new skills of cooking, but also implement their knowledge of the macros and sort of how to measure that and implement it into their daily lives. With that being said, overall, I would say that my project was a success. That's definitely what my sister said. She said it was good and that an effective teacher could do it. For me, myself, looking at it with a lot more, I guess, intensity, since I was the one who made it, looking back, there were things I could have done differently. I'd say my biggest regret was not deciding on how I wanted to organize the information until I had all the information. So it definitely would have been better to sort of have at least some understanding of how I wanted to organize it. Even if I changed that later on, it still would have been better than just not having anything up until the point of actually putting it all together into one spreadsheet in this example, plus a folder. But at the same time, I still consider it a success because it can be handed to a teacher. Another thing I would change is, like she was saying, adding in a rubric. I try to give it up to interpretation as much as possible to give the teacher enough room to play around with, because every school situation is different and every school has different students. But I believe that I should have given a little bit more structure to it, maybe. The course itself, not the project, so that the teacher did have a lot better starting point than just leaving it completely open to interpretation. Because even with that situation, they could easily just not do something with it. Once again, I'm not the one teaching the class. I'm just the one who wants to give the option and the availability of it so that any school or any teacher can pick it up. Overall, I learned a lot from this course and a lot from doing this project, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.